Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you've had some good food. Quick course correction. They're here to listen to you, not me. So let's get that out of the way. No pressure. But lovely to have you. Good to see you again. Really picking off on where Audrey left us on in terms of the fan as the only constituency which really matters. Is it fair to say, I'm stirring the pot here a bit, that sports emerged from COVID with a degree of humility? And why is that the case?
I don't know. Sport and humility don't go together that well as a concept for me. It's not really been my experience. But there's definitely one thing that we can say for sure, which is that the way that fans consume sport, the way that they engage with it, has changed in quite a profound way. Some of which is just an acceleration of stuff that was going on beforehand, but some of it's kind of much more real. So, just to kind of pick on a few of the things which we can see as most significant. First of all, a lot of fans are now focused much more on engaging with sport through OTT platforms. To kind of give a sense of how far that's come, 4 years ago, the top four football leagues in Europe and UEFA Champions League, together the total amount of media rights revenue for OTT was 4% of the total. It's now 23% 4 years later. It's a huge change. If we look at fan-generated content, another fundamental change in the way that fans are now consuming it. I don't have the 2022 numbers yet, but if we compare 2021 with 2020 in terms of social media following of sports news and sports content, we can see that the volume on TikTok is up 30% in 1 year, up 30%. Facebook down 8%. There are, Twitch up 21% in 1 year. These are huge shifts in what's happening in the way that fans are effectively changing the game and engaging with sport.
It's a great start. Audrey, can we just check, are there any slides up? I can't see it from here. We've got 4 of them, which should be on a carousel, but they are there. Excellent, great. Let's take a step further forward. Why is this happening? Who should be concerned? And, will sport, as is traditionally its wont, sort of put its head in the sand and expect a white knight to come through? Or is this something structural, which could actually have an opportunity cost if sport wasn't agile enough?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not all about sport. So the way that consumers are consuming media and engaging with all entertainment is changing fast at the same time. And it's also not all changing at the same speed in all countries. It's really interesting out here in Asia. We have really the full range of different starting points for that change. If we look at a market like Japan, for example, is very, very traditional, still very dominated by linear TV and sports consumption still following that kind of pattern. And in the same region, we have China, which is really leading this digital transformation. So, one direction that everybody's going in, but different starting points. Who should be concerned about it? Well, everybody should be concerned about it. Rights holders certainly should be concerned about it. And so I think probably the biggest set of adjustments that have to happen at the moment are in the hands of rights holders in the region, but also those for whom the region is incredibly important, rights holders that exist outside the region.
Nielsen Sports done a fair bit of work in Europe around football, Premier League, FIFA, UEFA, Serie A, with DAZN, and football also in North Asia and Southeast Asia, to some extent in the ANZ as well, less so on the subcontinent, is a very common currency. How would you sort of compare the behavior of, and hence the opportunity with, the football fan in Europe broadly, vis-a-vis the football fan in Asia?
Well, there are some differences that existed prior to the pandemic as well. Football fans in Asia have generally come to football more recently. So a lot of the kind of the established loyalties and traditions that we find in Western Europe and even in the US now with football work a little bit differently in Asia. So there are more likely to be a portfolio of different things, different teams that are followed, not the same kind of loyalty to a particular team. There's much more which is driven on athletes. And of course, where there are local heroes, that's incredibly important. So a local hero, almost irrespective of which team or where on the planet they play, can drive huge volumes of engagement.
You spoke about local heroes on the pitch. We've looked at sort of fragmentation of demand. You mentioned TikTok, Facebook. I want to move the conversation more towards individual publishers, creator economy, influencers, but also player publishers. So if you define influencer as somebody who's not a former player, but an active fan, as opposed to a player publisher who's probably a current player or a recently retired player who was digitally native, how should brands, how should federations be thinking about these two different types of creators, be it the influencer or the player publisher?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a super interesting area, and actually, in the practice that we have across the region at the moment, influencer marketing altogether, which obviously is mainly not about sport, but mainly about influencers. But obviously within sport, there are some very, very important influencers, and some of the influencers with the largest followings on the planet, Ronaldo, Messi, Federer, these are properties which absolutely compete with the largest influencers on the planet. But what we're actually finding in the region is that the challenge with those huge global personalities is, firstly, they're very expensive from a brand point of view, and secondly, there isn't actually that much you can get them to do for you. What we're finding now is that with many of the brands that we work with, it actually works out better or a better return on investment for them if they are managing a portfolio of smaller influencers. And as a result of this trend, we've actually developed a database of about 100 million influencers throughout the world. We've sorted them all out in terms of their relevance, their reach, their resonance, and the predicted ROI that they can bring in order to allow brands to manage a larger stable of influencers. And of course, this is also good for the region because this then creates some space for local heroes to compete well, despite the fact that there are these huge personalities in sport.
And do you find it's almost like global, local, local, global becomes local, local in many ways? Do you find brands are more amenable, agile to tap into those local networks more than rights holders, simply because they're far more closer to the consumer, they have activation budgets on a per country basis, or am I oversimplifying it and federations are beginning to sort of catch on more of a ground up rather than a top down approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we can talk about federations, we can talk about leagues, but really importantly, we can talk also about teams within leagues throughout the region who are more likely to have a credible connection with a local area and can bring local heroes into that local area. So brands are certainly trying to get organized around getting into that local connection, local engagement. And I think that this is something that's going to be really important for those kind of medium-sized or even small rights holders around the region who at the moment find it difficult to drive commercial growth through sponsorships. And if we look at the type of brands that are starting to come through that are very interested in that local connection now, retailers, insurance companies, and increasingly now energy companies as well, starting to try to actually get down into local communities for various reasons.
And if you sort of look at your conventional funnel, awareness, intent, purchase, is it more the intent purchase part of the funnel that these three industry sectors that you mentioned are more active and using influencers in the context of sport?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's all about, as is true generally in sponsorship as well, it's all about trying to get into the consideration set and not being rejected from the consideration set because people don't recognize them as organizations which are investing in those local communities. And, you know, not just in Asia, but in other regions as well, we're finding coming out of the pandemic, very often people are now more aware of their local community and therefore more aware of whether or not their local retailer or other large local employers are investing in that community or not. And so I think you know, what we're seeing across boardrooms in Asia is the kind of coming together of the brand marketing function and the CSR function. And traditionally what those two budgets were trying to drive, particularly at a local community level, there's a real opportunity now.
Interesting. Yatsu spoke this morning about shareholder interest and stakeholder interest. One stop down. But I want to come back to the boardroom dynamic, but you also spoke about consideration set. And I think probably the biggest consideration set that sport has dealt with in a very positive manner is the growth of women's sport. For the last 5 years, began before COVID. We've just finished the Euros, very successful Euros.
By the way,
the right team won. Yes, I know, the right team won. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. Talk us through a fly on the wall sort of conversation, you know, around football, brands, federations, clubs, venues. Is it same but different, or is it something which is eventually going to be a different font, different page size, different color?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the Women's Euros because if anybody is not aware of the fact that England won it, you heard it here now. So super proud and, you know, super enjoyed watching that competition. It was an absolute triumph. But this is really the conversation around women's professional sport that we find is that over the last 5 years, whilst women's professional team sports have been on the rise, one of the kind of real frustrations is that you'll get a moment like the Euros where you know, national heroes are born, there's a huge media coverage associated with success in a particular event, but that interest and engagement dissipates very, very quickly after the event. And for brands who want to invest in women's football or indeed in other properties, what they're really interested in is being able to command a kind of sustained engagement over a period of time. And that's really what's been missing. So for me, the really exciting things that have been happening this year in women's sport have been, back in March, 91,000 spectators in the Nou Camp for the Barca women. And actually just last weekend, Tottenham and Arsenal had 47,000 in the Emirates, which is, again, I think a new record set for the Women's Super League. So that's what's going to make the difference, because that then creates a platform that brands can, and why is it happening? Well, it's happening partly because these heroes are being created and people are becoming more engaged with their stories. The second reason it's happening is because the clubs, who are powerful influencers in themselves, are challenging the fans to come along to see the women's football as well and making it much more part of the identity of the club. And the final thing is that brands are also engaging in a different kind of way. And what's really exciting there is that quite a lot of the brands which are investing in women's team sports now are brands that have never invested in sports sponsorship at all in their history. So just to pick one example out of the air, Boots the Chemist, a big retailer in the UK, has never sponsored anything, has now sponsored the Women's FA, and is doing really well. We've been a little involved in measuring the ROI that they're getting out of that. It's really working out very, very well for them. So I see that as a movement, again, in Western Europe, in the US, Australia is, you know, one of the best cases in the world, particularly with the women's AFL. We've got the Women's Empowerment League getting going in Japan. Rest of Asia, well, you know, probably, I don't know, what's the state of cricket, women's cricket in India?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating what you say, because I think Disney Star, and the ICC just renewed for 4 years for 3.1 billion.
Yeah.
And the previous 8-year cycle was 1.8, and there were 2 different packages, men's and women's, and they clubbed the whole thing together.
Yeah.
And that's so if you do it on a mark-to-market basis, on a per-match basis, it probably will come out as probably amongst the higher-ranking per-match media rights assets,
Yeah.
which would be the women's team. But of course, we won't talk about the controversy of the third one-day internationals, but that's fine. I guess in many ways, the involvement and the emergence of women's sport was an inevitable part of a larger social trend. It is 50% of society. Esports and gaming is a bit of a different one. Is it sort of apples and oranges, or do you find that it's just sport broadening itself, either by choice or by circumstance? Where do you see that trend coming? How do you think about it? How do you frame those conversations with clients?
Yeah, no, I think that's different, actually. And the reason that it's different is that esports is a phenomenon of the gaming industry, first and foremost. It's those communities that we're reaching into there. And so from a kind of sponsorship point of view, particularly attractive, because that's reaching across to, I mean, the global games industry and the global games engaged audience is actually far larger than the sports audience. But of course, you know, the two overlap. There are plenty of people that enjoy sports and enjoy gaming as well. But there are some challenges that come with that as well, because it's a different ecosystem from traditional sports. So the typical conversations that we're in, brands sometimes need help to understand the ecosystem. So what's the correct entry point for sponsorship in esports? Is it a team? Is it an event? And then there are some kind of other broader challenges for brands associated with the type of content, the different genres which are there. And the reality is that the genres that portray significant violence are the ones that everybody is watching. So if you actually are looking for reach, it's in that part of the, and that's not for every brand. And the final point is that it's a super skeptical, sensitive audience. So getting the tone right is incredibly important. And you know, there are many, many examples of brands that have tried to step into esports that have ended up with very, very lame activations that have been called out. So it's a great opportunity potentially. And in Southeast Asia, it's a really exciting one for a larger range of brands, partly because Southeast Asia is much more focused, the games industry is much more focused on mobile gaming rather than console gaming. And it's evolved in a way where the gender balance amongst the gamers and the esports enthusiasts is much, much more balanced than in the rest of the world. So I was in the Philippines recently, and in the Philippines, the esports fan base is about 60% men, 40% women. If we compare that with Western Europe, it's more like 80-20. In the US, it's more like 90-10. So it's a really different, much more interesting opportunity, partly because of the way that the gaming industry has evolved here in Southeast Asia.
Fascinating. Your point about the emphasis on violence. I guess any NHL sponsor might be game, perhaps. But, we've got a couple of minutes. I'm conscious of time, and we've purposely sort of not taken questions from the floor primarily so that we can give Mike enough airtime. But Mike's going to be around, so if you have any questions for him, then please do get in touch. Final 100 seconds. Boardroom you mentioned earlier. What's the one thing which keeps chief execs up at night, or is the weaker moment admission of where there's a haziness about what's over the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, the last 2 weeks I've been in boardrooms in Thailand, South Korea, Indonesia, and here in Singapore. And the highest frequency topic has been about, with sponsor brands, has been about how do we, in the new era, manage the portfolio of investments that we've got? How do we really understand? How can CFOs really understand which investments are working for them and which aren't? And so a huge amount of work that we're doing is focused around understanding not only the media exposure that's happening, but also the direct impact on sales in the short term and in the longer term, and then putting that together into a benchmark framework that allows real judgments to be made. And I think this just shows a trend across the industry around the world of just really upping the level of evidence that brands need to provide that things are actually working. And sponsorship, we know from all of the mathematical modeling that we do, generally the ROI in year 3 in a sponsorship arrangement is around about 3 times what it is in the first year. So if you imagine, as we're starting to come out of the pandemic now, where everything has been switched off, a lot of that kind of mental architecture in consumers' minds needs to be rebuilt. And so there's a kind of a tense moment where we need to prove the returns, but we also need to be a little bit patient. The returns will come as sport kind of moves forward.
Be patient. Try saying that to a client or a CFO.
Yep.
Mike, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your pearls of wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Mike Wragg.